and welcome to The Black Room. This is the podcast for all things erotic mind control, and I am your host, Callidus. Very good to be back. I have been off for a little while, using the time to recharge and to work. I've been pretty busy as of late, but happy to be back now because there's some really, really fun things coming up in this episode that we're going to be talking about. I have several story recommendations for some really excellent things that have gone up recently at the Erotic Mind Control Story Archive, a director's commentary for a new animation that I have recently posted to my website called Proxy, and then the last bit of the show, I'm going to be talking about a really interesting story that I heard a number of years ago, which deals with the question as to whether or not Yoko Ono might have used hypnosis to bring John Lennon back to her during the period of time that they were separated. It's a really interesting story, and I'm looking forward to talking about that. But first, I'm looking forward to talking about a new author who has posted a new story to the Erotic Mind Control Story Archive. The story is called A Night in Yellowbird Bar, and it was uploaded on August 8th, and the author is robotbrainhumanheart. Now, I'm going to go into some minor spoilers on this story. I'll give you some of the characters and some of the premise, but I won't spoil too many of the details. So the protagonist of this story is a woman named Joey, Jo as she's known throughout the story. And Jo has a friend, Caitlin, who has fallen under the sway of a seductive woman referred to as Mistress Amy. And Jo is very upset by this. Jo is very upset at the changes she sees in Amy and the humiliating and derogatory things that Caitlin is doing with this new friend she has, Mistress Amy. And so Jo is determined to rescue Caitlin from Mistress Amy. And this is a scenario that we've all seen before in various erotic mind control stories. And so I think you'll have some idea already where this might be going. But I think what is interesting about this story is that Robot Brain Human Heart plays with the flow of time in a very satisfying way. It allows for maximum dramatic impact on where you start the story and where you end the story, and conversely, where the characters begin and where they end up. And I don't want to say too much here because I don't want to sort of ruin the effect of the device, but it is really, really fun the way that the flow of time is handled in the story and the way that it allows you to see things and reflect on what you already know. And it just works exceptionally well. There are some ridiculously hot moments in this story. It's a 5-part story, so you'll definitely get your money's worth. Each part ranges in length from maybe 700 words to almost 3,000, something like that. So it's a good chunk of story. Enough time to really explore a lot of nuance and a lot of different approaches to this scenario, which granted we have seen before, but presented exceptionally well here by Robot Brain Human Heart. It's very clever, it's very dramatic, and it was the story that really solidified for me that Robot Brain Human Heart was an author that I needed to keep an eye on. And this is not the only story that I'm going to be talking about from this author this week. There's another story that went up with the August 15th update on the archive, and it is called Sessions. Now, again, minor spoilers here. I'll give you a little bit of the setup, the characters, and so forth. I don't want to reveal too much because the payoff in both of these stories, the payoff is so worth the journey, and I want to entice you to take the journey without telling you everything about the destination. Although, if I'm honest with you, Robot Brain Human Heart is doing most of the enticing, and I'm just repeating things. So, Sessions. Sessions deals with a character called Chloe, who is a therapist. She has a patient who presents a unique challenge for her. Her patient was the victim of a cruel and powerful hypnodomme, and through hypnotic conditioning, Chloe's patient became an utter slave to her mistress. Now, Chloe wants to help her patient, but she also really, really wants to masturbate while her patient describes being a mind-controlled slave. So it's quite the dilemma for Chloe, and it's quite the story for Robot Brain and Human Heart. Now, they posted their first story to the archive on August 1st, and have posted, in most cases, multiple stories ever since. I think that this is definitely someone that you're going to want to go and check out. I haven't finished the other stories that are there in their catalog. I think that, yes, there's 7, and I've only read 3 at this point, so I still have quite a few to get through. But right now, everything that I've seen from Robot Brain Human Heart has been really good. Very clever, very hot, very well written, and some great ideas at play. So already you can see with just a few stories that this author has uploaded that there is an interesting kind of mythos beginning to form in their work. This is somebody that I think you really, really need to check out. They're going on my watch list. This is somebody who I'm going to be looking to check out every single thing they do as they upload. And I can say that I haven't been this excited about a new author in a long time. And already the quality of their work and the style of their work is very, very reminiscent of the great authors that a lot of us talk about, and the names that we throw around: Trilby, Tabaco, Iago, Thrall, Softi, Arclight, Catslave. So that style of writing, that particular dramatic approach, is something that I'm very, very fond of, and Robot Brain Human Heart is absolutely playing in that area of the sandbox, and I applaud them for it. So, and I'm very thankful for it as well. So, if I haven't given you the hard sell enough, please go check out these stories. They are absolutely worth your time, and I think that, well, I hope that Robot Brain Human Heart continues to put out great, great work like this, because it's going to make looking forward to that update at the archive every weekend all the more exciting. Now, speaking of story recommendations, last week I was talking about Softi, talked about a couple of stories, and obviously we all know I'm a big fan of Softi. And I told you then that if I was wrong about Softi's gender, which I referred to Softi as a she last week, then I would happily correct the record and apologize this week. And guess what's about to happen? I've since been informed that Softi is in fact a he, and so I apologize, and I am now correcting the record. Well, what's interesting is that Softi left a very nice note on my website, just being very gracious about the fact that I was rightfully fawning over their terrific stories. So anyway, it was a very, very gracious thing to do, and nowhere in this very gracious comment did Softi correct me and say I'm actually a guy. So anyway, I appreciate you not outright embarrassing me, but as I have obviously no difficulty in embarrassing myself. But while Softi didn't broach the subject, as I said, a listener let me know, so just want to put that out there. And my apologies. But since he didn't bring it up in his comment, I'm assuming it's not that big a deal. Or maybe he just likes the air of mystery, in which case I've ruined that too. So, moving on. By way of an apology, I guess the one good thing that I can do here is I can talk about some more work from Softi, because he's put out some more work this week. And there's another fantastic story that was posted to the archive called Playing with Fire. Now, similar to one of the stories I talked about last time, Saving Abby, this was influenced by Trilby Elsa's Bridesmaid, which, as I sit here talking about it, may in fact be my favorite Trilby Elf story ever. Now, tomorrow, I may pick a different one, but as I sit here thinking about it, everything that Trilby sort of does that kind of comprises his style, I think is in that story and done really, really well. I love Bridesmaid. Anyway, back to Softy. The other story that was a big influence here was Jukebox's Flesh for Fantasy. And of the two stories that Softy has done recently, and where he's been playing around with this idea, I think that Playing with Fire is my favorite of the two. I really, really like this one. Now, again, I'm going to give you some minor. Now, again, I'm going to give you some minor spoilers. I'm going to give you the characters and the setup, just enough, I hope, to lure you in, ha ha ha, and get you to read the full thing. The protagonist in this case is a college student called Amy. She has a friend, also a student, named Carolyn. And Carolyn has discovered that one Professor Collins has a talent for hypnosis, and that Professor Collins has been using hypnosis to turn lovely girls into lovely, obedient slaves. Now, Carolyn has proof of this, that the professor probably does not want getting out. The only problem is that Carolyn has a very well-developed fetish for mind control herself. And now here she is, with leverage on the evil Hypnodomme from her deepest, darkest fantasies. So what's a girl to do? Carolyn decides that she has to take advantage of this opportunity to indulge her fantasies, but she only wants to play. She doesn't want to become a slave. So she arranges to be hypnotized by Professor Collins. And she has a list of conditions that the professor's going to have to abide by, which ultimately boil down to, you can't turn me into a slave. Now, to ensure that the nefarious professor keeps her word, she video records each of their sessions. And she enlists her friend Amy to watch the sessions and to make sure that the professor is playing by the rules and doesn't try to turn Carolyn into another one of her slaves. Now, Amy is not especially enthusiastic about this arrangement. She's a little creeped out by the EMC fetish. She is a lot creeped out by Professor Collins' behavior, but Carolyn is her best friend, and exploring this kink means a lot to her, so Amy resigns herself to keeping one eye on the video and one eye on her homework as she's trying to study. And hopefully she'll pay just enough attention to make sure that Carolyn isn't getting in over her head. And the rest you're going to have to read for yourself, and trust me, you really, really want to do that because it's incredibly hot. I think it's really interesting to watch an artist approaching the same idea in different ways. There's obviously something about this that really sparks something in Softy, and it's really interesting to kind of see him take a bite at it, step away, and then change perspective a little bit and take another bite. And just these different permutations, these different variations on a theme, I find very, very interesting. It's something that I've done many times in my own work. I'm sure many of you have as well. And I think that one of the things that really connects me with this particular story is that there's an aspect of it that's very similar to a manip that I've worked on a couple of times, but I've never completed to my own satisfaction. But there's an idea which I won't go into specifically because the thing would be a little bit more of a spoiler for the story than I want to give. But there's an idea in this story that I've played around with myself, and I really, really like Softy's approach to it. It's done in a way that I didn't quite have the imagination to follow through on, I guess. And I like the way that it's done here. So I really, really dig what Softy did with the story. And I suppose that it's appropriate we're talking about Softy again, because this animation that I'm going to talk about right now, this new one that I just put out, was definitely inspired in part by Softy's work. So I put out a new animation called Proxy this week. And it's interesting and a little bit unique in that it's one of the few, if not perhaps the only, I think I've got at least a couple of other animations that don't involve nudity, but this is definitely one of the few I have that has no nudity in it. And it's not especially suggestive of sexuality either, but it is very suggestive of domination, or at least that's what I felt coming into it. The piece features two female models, one staring out of frame, looking to me deeply entranced, and the other holding her by her hair, maybe her head, mouth very close to her ear, whispering who knows what sort of decadent suggestions and commands. And another thing that I really, really liked about the source image, as if those things weren't enough, is that it's almost but not quite a black and white image. And I love black and white photography, and this image has a lot of those aspects, makes great use of light and shadow, and that specific quality, the contrast in this image, inspired me to create this projected spiral that would only appear in the areas of light and would give the submissive model something to look so entranced about. So it's been a while ago that I did that. I did this animation and all of the masking and everything that's required to pull this thing off, because you can see both the animation on her face as well as the wall behind them. So I've had that done for quite a while, but I have been just completely blocked on creating a story for it. I was on Uzubono's DeviantArt page not too long ago, and she had a post up talking about how she was really blocked trying to work on the latest issue of Aria of the Hive, and I was just sympathizing and saying, I know exactly how you feel, because I've been in a similar place myself with one of my projects. And it's really frustrating because I like the image so much and I really wanted to write something for it. I didn't want to just put out the image, which is usually what I do when I have something that I just can't think of a story for. If I'm really desperate, then I'll just put the image out without an animation and let it go. Or sometimes I'll turn it into one of the animated banners on my website if it's of sufficient resolution. But in any case, I really, really wanted to write something for this. And so I pulled the project file back out recently and took another look at it to just see if there was anything there that might spark my my creativity. And as I looked at it this time, I was looking at the costume, the jewelry, and so forth that the ladies are wearing. And there's a certain element of elegance and refinement to what I was seeing. And it took me back to Softi and the society of hypnodommes from the melting mythos that I had been talking about on the show last time. And that was just enough to kind of get me over the hurdle and start thinking about, okay, so maybe they're a part of this sort of society, and then everything just kind of started to tumble into place. I decided that it was going to be a broken bomb story, and it was going to be about a mistress who had let herself be topped by another dominant. Maybe it was a one-time thing, just curious herself, or maybe just in the mood for something a little bit different, but somewhere or another she kind of slipped up without realizing how dire a situation she was putting herself in, but she kind of let this other dominant get a whiff of submission out of her, and then things kind of spiral out of control from there. And I envisioned all of these things that might have happened, her going back for more, and then the phone calls start. She's at home in her own manor with her own slaves, and the phone rings, and she drops everything and hops in the limo to go and visit this other mistress, leaves maybe one or two of her own slaves in the limo for hours at a time while she's in this other mistress's home doing who knows what, but coming back looking disheveled and with this slightly glassy-eyed appearance, and after each one of these visits, taking a bit longer to bounce back into the swing of being a dominant. And so all of those things came pretty rapidly after this initial burst of inspiration, which I guess boils down to, I'll just steal from Softy. And so all of that kind of fell into place pretty rapidly once I settled on that initial strategy. And since the image itself was not particularly suggestive, sexually speaking, I decided to make myself the goal of writing a very erotic and very decadent sort of story. I thought it would be a fun counterpoint to the imagery itself. And it was a lot of fun to finally have it finished. I have a lot of similar pieces like this, things that I had an inspiration for the imagery, for the hypnotic method that would be employed or something like that. And I knock that out immediately, and then sometimes it takes, like with this one, it was maybe a year or two that I've had this one kind of sitting on the back burner. But it's interesting sometimes just the long journey that these things can take to finally arriving at completion. So I'm very happy to have finally put a checkbox in the completed column for Proxy and to have it out in the world. So if you haven't already, I do recommend you go check out Proxy, which you can find on my website, callidus-mc.com, and I do hope you enjoy it. If you are a fan of my particular flavor of erotic mind control, I think there will be something there for you to get into. All right, now let's move on to the main event, the thing that I teased at the top of the show. This story is actually something that I wrote down the first time I started brainstorming an idea for a podcast that would deal with the erotic mind control fetish and community. This is one of the things I put down on the list, but I would want to talk about on the show at some point. It's a story that I heard many years ago, and it is one of those things that I don't know that I've seen in the erotic mind control community. I don't know if anybody's talked about this on the forums or whatever, but it's a really, really interesting story about some people that almost all of us are at least somewhat familiar with. And like all good stories, it starts off with a question. Was Yoko Ono a hypnodomme? And I am, in fact, referring to Yoko Ono, the avant-garde artist who married John Lennon in 1969 and is generally credited, fairly or otherwise, with breaking up the Beatles. Now, the two of them separated briefly during the mid-70s, and during that time, John dated a young woman named May Pang. And May Pang thinks that there's a possibility that John Lennon was hypnotized into going back to Yoko Ono. Now, this story comes to me by way of the Coast to Coast AM radio show, which is the show that runs late at night where they talk about UFOs and conspiracy theories and things like that. And actually, and this is a really interesting detail as well, a friend of mine heard this show. They were a listener of Coast to Coast, and I guess they have like a membership because they were able to download the MP3s for the show. But a friend of mine had heard this show. This is one of my vanilla friends. This is one of my real life friends who doesn't know about Callidus or the mind control thing. One of my real life friends hears the show, gets the MP3s, sends me an email and says, heard this on Coast to Coast the other night, thought you might be interested. And I start listening to the show and having kind of a panic attack because I'm like, they know. Oh my God, they know. But of course, they were just referring to the fact that it was about John Lennon, and I'm a big fan of John Lennon and the Beatles and so forth. So they, in fact, did not know about the hypnosis thing and how that might have had some significance to me as well. But it was kind of a tense moment. Anyway, this episode aired originally on August 2nd, 2008. It was hosted by Ian Punnett, and he did a 2-hour or so interview with May Pang, followed by a Q&A where people were calling into the show. And May Pang was there promoting a photo book that she had released called Instamatic Karma, which was a series of photographs that she had taken during this 18-month period or so, I think it was a little bit more than 18 months, where she and John Lennon dated after he separated from Yoko in 1973. Later, John would refer to this period of time as his lost weekend. And Ian Punnett sets up and teases this interview by asking the question, was John Lennon hypnotized into coming back to Yoko Ono? Now, May Pang started by working for the Beatles management company in New York City in 1969. And I think she was 18 at the time. And she began to shift sometime in late 1970s. She sort of shifted into the role of being a personal assistant to John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And so she was just the person who did whatever they needed done, making phone calls, mailing things, accepting deliveries, just all that kind of stuff. And she was with them pretty constantly in their apartment in New York City, in the office, and just taking care of whatever they needed taken care of. She was that kind of employee. So one day, before work starts, she is approached by Yoko Ono. Yoko comes into her office one morning and says to her, well, John and I have been having some problems, which everybody in the office knows. Everybody knows there's some sort of tension going on between John and Yoko. So Yoko tells May Pang, John and I are having problems and we're going to separate. And May Pang is thinking, great, just what I need. Now there's going to be this turmoil at the office and it's going to be very awkward and tense for everyone. And just as she's thinking how awkward and tense things might get, Yoko goes on to say, well, John is going to start dating other people, and I think that you should date John. And May Pang's jaw hits the desk. He says, what? And Yoko goes on to say that she thinks that May Pang would be a really good fit for John. And May Pang credits Yoko with being very intuitive. She thought of her as being a woman with a lot of insight. And so Yoko proceeds to propose that her personal assistant, May Pang, become her husband's girlfriend. So she apparently has also told John this at some point, because later in the day when May Pang meets John, there's this very awkward exchange of, did Yoko talk to you? Yes. And so they both know what's expected of them. And May Pang says that she is in no way interested in getting involved with John Lennon. This is her boss, and she said that she had never given any consideration, never looked at him in a romantic way whatsoever. And she's very, very uncomfortable. John, on the other hand, is a little bit interested, and perhaps Yoko knows that. And John is very keen on the idea of getting into a romantic relationship with May Pang. So he pursues her for several weeks, and eventually they do get together. And May Pang says that once they did get together, that she actually found herself really, really involved in the relationship, not just being a casual thing, but she found herself really romantically interested in John Lennon. So perhaps Yoko was right. Perhaps her insight proved out and they were a good fit for each other. So with their relationship solidifying, May Pang leaves her position as a personal assistant. She continues to work for the record company and to do things like booking sessions and setting up musicians, scheduling, those kinds of things. But she leaves behind the day-to-day personal assistant work now that she and John are officially an item. And apparently this goes very, very well. Apparently they got along really great. They had a great time. According to a friend of John's, John would later say that some of his happiest moments were with May Pang. And she encouraged him to improve his relationship with Julian, who was his son from his first wife, Cynthia. And that whole period of time seems to be a really positive one, generally speaking, for John Lennon. It's also during this time that he's beginning to reconcile with Paul McCartney and George Harrison. I get the impression that his relationship with Ringo was always on pretty good ground following the breakup of the Beatles, but he and Paul had pretty serious animosity for each other, and of course George did as well. And during this period of time, she said that John had buried the hatchet with George, and that they had visited a little bit, and that he'd been talking with Paul more, and in fact was beginning to talk about the possibility of writing with Paul again. Apparently, Paul and his wife Linda were in New Orleans recording an album, and John was talking about maybe going down to see them, and he had asked May Pang what she thought about the idea of him writing with Paul again, and she encouraged it. She said, you guys are great apart, but you're not as good as you are together. Together, you guys make a really, really amazing songwriting duo. And so it just seemed like there were all of these interesting possibilities on the horizon during this year and a half or so that John and May Pang are together. And in fact, there's an interesting anecdote that she tells, and I guess that this would be especially interesting to the Coast to Coast audience, but I'll just briefly mention that she details a UFO encounter that she and John had at their apartment in New York. She's like, they're there one weekend. I guess everybody else is gone. She said like they were almost the only people in the building. Everybody had gone to the Hamptons, she says. And it's late one night, and they're talking about ordering some food, and John goes out on the balcony, and there's a UFO, and it flies over their building, and they watch it for 10 minutes or something like that. But anyway, that was that was a big divergence in the interview was going into this whole UFO encounter that she says that she and John had. So anyway, they get together in late 1973 and early 1975. Yoko Ono asked John for a divorce, and John agreed. However, Yoko kept postponing it because she said that the stars weren't right yet to do the divorce. And Yoko's interested in spirituality and astrology and all this, so she's waiting for something to line up so that they can do this divorce properly. At this point, John and May Pang they're shopping for a home. And they've been out on the West Coast for a little while. They've come back to New York, and they're going to move out of this apartment building. They're looking for a home somewhere. And John is also talking about quitting smoking. He's noticing that it's affecting his voice in the studio, his ability to sustain notes and so forth. And it's something he's been wanting to do for a while. And in fact, Yoko had stopped smoking at some point, whether it was before or after they split. But Yoko had stopped smoking with the help of a hypnotherapist. And she, who was still in contact with John, obviously, she suggested to John that he should come and see her hypnotherapist, that she was able to stop smoking and that he probably would be able to as well. And John was pretty keen on doing that, so he agreed. Now, Yoko arranges this hypnosis session with John, and he would ask her about it, and she'd say, no, the day isn't right. Again, possibly pointing to some sort of astrology motive. But they'd set it up a few times and then cancel at the last minute because something wasn't quite right yet. So one Friday morning, Yoko calls and says, it has to be today. Come over to my place and we'll have the hypnosis session today. And May Pang, for whatever reason, although they've been talking about doing this hypnosis thing for a while, for whatever reason, May Pang has an odd feeling. She's uncomfortable about something and she doesn't want John to go. And they end up arguing about it. And John reassures her, calms her down, says everything's going to be fine. He's going to be home that evening. and they're going to go out for dinner wherever she wants to go. So he leaves, and May Pang continues to have this feeling of apprehension. Well, John doesn't come home that night, and he doesn't come home the next day either. And so May Pang is calling, and Yoko is answering, but she's not letting May Pang talk to John. She says, that John's involved with this hypnosis session. It's going on for a while, and that he can't come to the phone. So all weekend long, May Pang doesn't hear from John Lennon. She calls several times, and Yoko won't put him on the phone. But John has a dentist appointment on Monday. And so May Pang goes to the dentist's office. John shows up, and she confronts him there. And she says that he's acting very strange. As they are preparing to leave the dentist office after the appointment, he asks her, "Where are you going?" And she says, "I'm going home. Where are you going?" And she says that John tells her then that Yoko is allowing me to come home. And May is very suspicious about this. It's a very odd thing to say, considering that he had agreed to a divorce from this woman in recent months. And she asks him what happened at this hypnosis session. And John described it as being like primal therapy, as in the trauma-based form of therapy that Arthur Janoff created and certainly tried to sell people on back in the 70s. It was sort of a fad thing then. I don't think that many people put any stock in it these days. But John described this weekend-long hypnosis session as being somewhat like primal therapy. He said he started out by drinking tea, and then he started to feel weak, and then started to feel nauseous, ended up throwing up. And there's some suspicion here that perhaps Yoko drugged him. And he gets a little bit fuzzy on the details. So then he tells May that it's probably better for his immigration status if he lives with Yoko. Of course, at this point in time, the Nixon administration is actively trying to deport him for his anti-Vietnam War activism. And being married to an American citizen might help him. So it would look a little bit fishy if he's married to Yoko on paper, but they're not living together. So this is a reason that he gives that he wants to do this. And he says that Yoko is fine with him continuing to see May Pang, which they do for a while. They do see each other a bit more, but the relationship, the life together that they had for that year and a half is effectively over at this point. Now, May Pang never uses the word brainwash during this interview, but that is the exact word that's used in Bill Harry's book, The John Lennon Encyclopedia, and he says that May Pang described what happened to John Lennon over the course of that weekend as brainwashing, that Yoko brainwashed him to come back to her. So, did Yoko Ono use hypnosis to win back John Lennon? I don't know. But the facts are that John was in a committed relationship with another person, that he described his time with May Pang to other friends as some of his happiest. They were in the process of buying a house. He goes to Yoko Ono's home for a hypnosis session. No one hears from him or sees him in 3 days. And when the weekend is over, he drops everything that he's been doing in his life and goes back to Yoko. Now, it's worth noting that Yoko Ono is a very sexual person herself. She has several lovers during the Lost Weekend period. She's certainly playing the field herself. John is also reported to have a voracious sexual appetite. So perhaps Yoko and John were a good counterpoint for one another in that sense. She's certainly intelligent, imaginative, and uninhibited person. She's got a controlling personality. She was very dominant. Everyone who knew her acknowledges that. If I separate myself for just a moment from the idea that Yoko may not only have broken up the Beatles, but also prevented them from getting back together, if I take May Pang's account as being accurate, even though hers is the only account we have for this series of events, if you forget for a second the names John and Yoko, and just look at the situation, you have a man who used to be with a woman who some people don't think was good for him, who some people consider to be a controlling, perhaps even manipulative person, but she's smart and sexual, which sounds a little bit like a femme fatale. The man then meets the nice girl. They connect, they're happy, but then he spends a weekend with his former lover, this dominant woman, who has him placed under hypnosis, who perhaps drugs his tea, who spends 3 days doing who knows what, while he's in this altered state under hypnosis. And whatever it is must be mind-blowing enough to completely change or alter, if you will, his mind, to completely rearrange his priorities, because his top priority at the end of that weekend becomes going back to the intelligent, dominant, sexual woman that he was originally with. And when you think about it in those terms, it sounds an awful lot like any number of the stories that you might find over on the Erotic Mind Control Story Archive. It just so happens that this story is about a man named John Lennon and a woman named Yoko Ono. So, I don't know if it happened the way that May Pang said. We only have her as a source on this story. So who knows? Who knows how much credence to really put into it? And perhaps she's capitalizing on the fact that, on the whole, people probably don't have a highly positive opinion of Yoko Ono, whether that's fair to the woman or not. But there's something about this story that's really, really fascinating. And it's just an interesting little anecdote that I heard many years ago and have only had the opportunity to share with a few people, because it's a long story and it takes quite a while to type that out in email. So I've only gone through the rigors of doing it a couple of times. But I'm here sharing it with you now because it's always been an interesting piece of modern folklore, in my mind at least, an interesting tall tale that relates to a couple of people that I've always been very, very intrigued by and very interested in, and just happens to tie in with my kinky proclivities to erotic mind control. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this story. And if any of you have heard the story before, if you know anything about this or maybe have some more details of your own, I'd love to hear them. So you can comment on this episode over at my website, callidus-mc.com. If you have any thoughts at all on the episode to share, of course, I'm happy to read them. Your questions, comments, and suggestions are always welcome, and I always enjoy hearing from you, and it's wonderful to hear that people are listening to the show and enjoying the show. It makes doing these all the more fun. So thanks very much for hanging out and listening to me once again. I'll be back next time with another episode of the Black Room Podcast. Until then, farewell.